Welcome everybody to this presentation that I have been the most excited about since I attended Dr. Joseph Allen's presentation with Zoomtopia back in October. I was there for 2 full days and his was the presentation. I said, I need to see if he will come and talk to Toastmasters. He's the leading expert in the world in online meetings. He's an organizational uh, psychologist, and he'll correct whatever mistakes I make in his information. But about 25% of all the research on meetings was done by this man. He's going to share his information about his book that was put out in COVID. And I have been reading it diligently. It is chock full of great information. Please put your hands up. Help me welcome Dr. Joseph Allen.
Thanks for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate that, Kathy. It means a lot. I'm glad you saw me at the Zoomtopia, and yeah, I'm glad you thought to invite me here today. I have a slide deck that I'll go ahead and share and share some thoughts and things for a little bit. You're welcome to interrupt me and ask questions or throw them in the chat. Happy to answer those as we go along, or at the end, whichever would be easiest for you all. So let me get my slides here going. So as Kathy indicated, I'm going to talk to you about Suddenly Virtual, which is actually a book that I wrote during the pandemic, which kind of makes sense because we all kind of experienced this suddenly virtual world that we moved into. It sounds like now we're starting to see a little bit of a transition to hybrid and other things of that nature, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But as you Kathy mentioned, I'm an industrial and organizational psychologist. I think I saw in the chat that someone else here is as well. So it's good to have some people here who understand the language that I speak in terms of research. But the Suddenly Virtual is interesting because it's really focused on this whole environment that we kind of fell into. And so as a meeting scientist, I had the lucky circumstances of accidentally deciding to study virtual meetings just before the pandemic. And so I'll go into that here in a couple minutes. But first, what I'd like to do is do a little bit of a reflection. And I'm going to see if I can make sure I can see the chat, because it's going to actually involve you all participating for a second here via the chat. So first thing, what I'd like to do is I'd like you to think back to October of 2019. Okay. What were your meetings like in October of 2019? And go ahead and put in the chat, it could be a one-word answer, it could be a sentence or two, but just go ahead and put in the chat, what were meetings for you like in 2019, before the pandemic, before all the chaos that came with that? Personal, in person, yep. Barbara, it looks like you say meeting at a coffee shop, in a private room, yeah. At a restaurant, oh, I've missed restaurants. Thank goodness we're able to go back to many of them now. Interactive, yes, Veronica. We already had online meetings at work, yeah, Kathy, yep. We had hybrid and live before. So yeah, we had the variety. That was the interesting thing, is we had the variety, and then suddenly we didn't. So, okay. More engaging at work, fun, okay. Social, hugging, small, intimate, shaking hands. For the first time in 14 months, I was actually shaking hands with people yesterday, which was great. We all had hand sanitizer we could use later, shortly thereafter if we really wanted to. But it was nice to have that. Eye contact, yeah, as opposed to looking at this little dot right here, right, to engage with our people, because I'm looking at that and it looks like to you it looks like I'm looking at you, right? But I'm not. I'm looking at a little dot, right? So fun stuff. Thanks, Veronica. Okay, so now that's October 2019. Okay, now think about what was it like in May of 2020. So just a year ago. Right? What were meetings like for you? Think about it in terms of during the pandemic, frankly. What were meetings like? And go ahead and answer in the chat, or put your thoughts in the chat if you'd like. Trying to navigate Zoom. Yep. Virtual, but good. Okay, Richard, good. All online. Yeah. Experimenting with Zoom, WebEx, Jitsi, Teams, Blue Jeans, Google Meet, you name it. They all had one. Multitasking during the meeting. Yeah, that was an interesting change, right? Or not. And when you're face to face, there was some multitasking that would happen because you have your laptop open potentially, and you'd be doing other things if you weren't needed for that part of the conversation. But man, you put it on virtual, and suddenly you've got your email open on one screen. You got if you can do a lot more other things, which means you're not engaged, right? It's really hard to be in two places at once. So, impersonal, same attendance. I'll have to Jim. Was that in terms of people showing up? Same number of people. Speeches were different. Okay, yeah. Finding creative things to do in Zoom, Kyle. Yeah. Trying to figure out how to keep people engaged, how to help them to remain engaged, even though, again, in a virtual environment on your computer, we have all these other things that we often do on the computer that we could easily do, especially if we turn off our camera, which we'll talk about here in a bit as well. Okay, thank you so much for participating in that. That's helpful. Kind of gets you thinking about the differences that we experience. Well, the interesting thing is in October 2019 was when I decided to study virtual meetings. And I collected data from 1,000 people on their virtual meeting experiences, right? And we found some interesting things there. And then because I had done that in October, I decided, you know what, let's go ahead and ask these same 1,000 people what their meetings are like in May, right? So a few months later, we're all sent home, or we're all dealing with the pandemic in a variety of ways. But for the most part, we all ended up online. So I asked the same people, what are your meetings like now that we're not, be able to do so much in person? And so I'm going to share some of those findings right now. So first thing, pre-COVID, almost 80% of our meetings were face-to-face. Okay. Probably no surprise, right? Only 3%, 4%, if you round up, were video, meaning what we're doing right now. During COVID, just a few months later, May 2020, down to almost 10% of face-to-face meetings, right? But our video shot crazy up to 60% of our meetings. So it literally was suddenly virtual. We went from mostly face-to-face, eye contact, nonverbals. I speak with my hands, and part of the reason I do that is because I'm trying to increase the amount of nonverbal communication in a virtual environment. Because in May of 2020, it all went away. Actually, it was in March, but we stopped being face to face, and it was all on video. Some other things were fascinating to us, though. We knew that switch had happened. It was all over the news. We all were kind of experiencing it. Interestingly enough, though, other things changed, like the length. So from face-to-face in pre-COVID went to, from 55 minutes, almost an hour, to about 40 minutes during COVID. Okay. Now, granted, we know that there was a lot fewer of them, but if you look across here, even our video meetings previously went down a little bit. And people were like, well, that's because the Zoom, default was 40 minutes. And so we were all doing. The answer is actually, no, we controlled for that. We took that into account, and we still see that during COVID, our meetings were just a little bit shorter. Okay. Which that's not so bad, I guess. Right. Especially if your meetings aren't great, which unfortunately that's the case in for a lot of our meetings. Then we looked at size. Okay, how many people are at these meetings? And we found that pre-COVID, there were 16 people in an average face-to-face meeting, 19 in a video meeting, and it went down quite a bit, right? Which both a little bit surprised us, but also didn't, because the interesting thing about virtual and hybrid meetings is the more people you have, the easier it is to diffuse and to engage in multitasking and to not be in the meeting, right? And so that's the real issue here, is that they got smaller, which is good from an efficiency standpoint, but it's also potentially bad in the sense that people aren't included. You might be excluding people that normally you would invite to a given meeting. So there's some things to think about there when you think about what might have happened. So what does this all mean? What do these changes actually tell us? Well, they introduce new challenges. new technology, Zoom, which we had to figure out how to use. It's interesting, whether younger or older, we had to figure out how to make this work, right? And, you talk about how old dogs can't learn new tricks. Well, old dogs had to learn new tricks, so they weren't going to see the grandkids. And that was the experience that my parents had with my children, right? Work-family conflict. I have a lot of friends who study this area, but this idea that, we sit, everybody who had an office, in an office building now had an office in their living room or at the dining room table, or wherever they could find a corner, hopefully a quiet corner, of their house to have their meetings, right? And then we started to hear about this electronic meeting fatigue. Is like, wait, we're like wearing ourselves out. And the truth is, the data was pretty consistent in this as well. Others have corroborated this, that we actually started working longer hours and having more meetings during the pandemic, right? And then we wonder why we're all exhausted. There's no wonder we actually transitioned from having a commute where we listened to a book or our favorite music, or we rolled the windows down and let the wind blow through our hair, whatever it was. There were things that we did in the commute that were enjoyable. Maybe not the traffic part, but there were other things. Well, we actually just absorbed the commute into our meetings and into our work. And that creates conflict with family, because that was time that we suddenly could have had with family, but we didn't, right? But also there were new opportunities. It's not all bad. The technology allowed us to work from anywhere. I'm working from my office at home, and I was so grateful that I was able to have an office, right? Because so many had the kitchen table or whatever they might be, right? But it also added a lot of flexibility. As long as you get an internet connection, you could sit in a park, right? Or other places outside, right? As long as the weather was nice, which was good for part of it. And then, of course, we had COVID winter. The overall reach of services. You see those commercials if you watch network television at all of Microsoft Teams advertising how our business has done better. We've been able to sell to people all over the world because we can now connect in this unique way. So the new opportunities did present themselves as well. However, there was this thing called Zoom fatigue, right? And we started seeing it in the news as early as April of 2020. People talking about, man, I'm just really exhausted, right? The first thing I want to clarify is that it is real, okay? Zoom fatigue is a real thing, okay? Second, it's actually all about something called emotional labor. And I talk about this in the book, but it's this idea that humans have this capability of expressing emotions, right? And they can control when and to what degree they have those emotions to some extent, right? That's why we have these things called servers with a smile, right? Whether they really want to serve you at the restaurant or not, they come up to you with a smile and say, how can I help you, right? And you can tell when they actually mean it, and you can tell when they're not really feeling it, right? Well, the interesting thing about virtual meetings is that when you're on camera, right, and you're supposed to be all peppy and excited because you're with your boss, and you don't want them to think that things are not as good as they ought to be, or that you're not as excited about the initiative they're proposing, or whatever it may be. But you got to fake it because your kids are running around, or your pets are not cooperating, or you're at home when you'd really rather be at the office, or people are dying from a pandemic. I mean, there was a lot going on, and so we would paint on this smile and maybe not actually feel that way. And we have a finite amount of cognitive, physical, and emotional resources, and that's draining. It drains you when you're having to fake it, right? When you're like, I'm happy when I'm not really. That's hard to do, okay? And so because these job demands were placed upon us, right, it started to drain. And we started to have these reports of Zoom fatigue and of stress, right? And so we actually asked these questions in 2019, and then we asked them, in May of 2020. And you can see here, this is on a 5-point scale. And for those of you who know statistics and have done survey research, know that about a 0.75 to 1.0 is a typical standard deviation on a 5-point scale. In other words, what all that means is pre-COVID, we weren't really doing much emotional labor in our meetings. Okay, we were pretty authentic. If we didn't like something, we would say it. If we did like something, we felt like we could say it, generally speaking, right? During COVID, a full standard deviation shift occurred, right? meaning we increased our emotional labor by a full standard deviation. And part of that was the circumstances, right? Part of that was being on Zoom and being on camera and seeing yourself and feeling like, oh, that's what I look like on camera. Oh my, right? And you start to behave a little differently, and that little difference makes a difference, right? It makes you more used up at the end of a day. And when you have meetings as often as many of us might have, it wears on you, right? Okay. Yes, 5 is high, Jim. So a high, it's 0 to 5 is the score here. So, okay, on this particular set of data. All right. So I've kind of painted a bit of a gloomy picture with a little bit of opportunity, right? And I apologize for it being a little bit gloomy, but I think we kind of lived it, right? And even as we transition out, hopefully, we lived this, right? And so the question is, what do we do about it? Both now, as we're maybe still in this environment of virtual most of the time, and as we transition out of it, okay? So I want to talk about 3 things, okay? The first is we need to recognize the need for recovery, okay? On average, a person needs 17 minutes to recover from a bad meeting. So if you've had a bad meeting, you need about 17 minutes on average to get out of the funk of that bad meeting, maybe find the restroom, maybe think about whatever the next task you need to do or the next meeting you need to go to, and then go. And how often do we have that, right? How often do you have, a meeting and then have a whole, quarter of an hour to just chill and recover? Not very often. In fact, we often have back-to-back meetings, which are just a killer, right? Because you don't have any break time whatsoever. However, with a good meeting, if you make your meetings good, and there's lots of good tips and tricks about that, and we can talk about that later. But if you have a good meeting, it takes about 5 minutes to recover. That's right. Even a good meeting, you need recovery time. There's a reason we send our kids to school and they have transition periods. That's because cognitively and biologically, we need a little bit of time between meetings, between activities. It allows our brains to cognitively transition from one topic to the next. And it's not so bad to be able to find a beverage, right? Or the restroom. And in the office, we would walk by the water cooler and grab a glass of water. We would walk by the restroom and, oh yeah, I need to take care of that real quick, right? We aren't going anywhere. So, during this suddenly virtual environment, I sit in this chair a lot more than I should. And so because of that, we aren't even building in those little human moments into our meetings. And so that's the first thing. We need to recognize the need for recovery and introduce it. So my advice, the tip associated with this one is make your 60-minute meetings 50 minutes and make your 30-minute meetings 25 minutes. And if you have other different sizes of meetings that you have, try to reduce them just a little bit, not a lot. Let's plan on having a good meeting so that way you only need about 5 minutes for recovery. But let's introduce some humanity into our meetings, okay? Let's allow people to recover, okay? So that's the first one. Second one, engage in the best practices. And I'm saying 2019 here because we found that 80% of pre-COVID best practices for meetings still apply, okay? That means that having an agenda, starting on time, making sure everybody gets to participate, those all still apply, okay? They didn't change, right? So much of that is still true. Okay, all this list, and I could go on and on and on. There's lots of little things that we probably knew we should have been doing in our meetings before that you might have been doing them, but I know I struggled to do them as well as I should have. They still apply. In fact, they're more important now because in this medium, little errors, little problems are more glaring. Right there, it's less forgiving of a medium, right? In a face-to-face, you can lean, you can laugh, you can chuckle, you can see the nonverbals that help you adjust and sense what the audience is feeling and that sort of thing. In a virtual environment, it's so much harder, okay? And so you got to do that much more and that much better in your efforts, okay? For example, think about participation in a virtual meeting, right? Versus a face-to-face meeting. In a virtual meeting, we kind of have to call on people because if Kathy's talking and Jim's talking, we can't hear what either one is saying. But in a face-to-face meeting, because of the nature of how air works, not the way a speaker works, we can actually, Jim and Kathy could talk at the same time, and we could kind of catch what both are saying, or there could be side conversations that are a little more easy, right? Whereas in a virtual, yeah, you've got the chat. You could technically have side conversations going on there, and there may be going on right now, but they're not the same. It doesn't work the same way. And so you have to be, if you're a meeting leader, you have to call on people. You have to say, hey, I haven't heard from you yet. Can you please share your thoughts on this, right? And if you don't do that, then people will feel left out. They'll feel unseen in this environment. Whereas in a face-to-face meeting, it's more easily facilitated to be seen and be heard. Okay, so you have to be more proactive in a virtual meeting, right? But that's not something that's a surprise, because it's a consistent best practice we've been telling people for years for our face-to-face meetings. Number 3 is engage in the 2020 best practices. We kind of already started talking about that with the virtual meetings, but virtual meetings are just a little bit different, right? So reduce your meetings by 10%. Like I said, take your 60 minutes, make them 50 minutes, take your 30 minutes, make them 25 minutes. Then you've got to think about the camera thing. And I know, Kathy, you purchased the book. Thank you. Not that that's going to pay my mortgage or anything, but I think what you've probably realized is that my co-author, Karen Reed, talks a lot about production value and how important it is to, especially when you're doing a presentation, do the best you can to minimize distractions, to work on your background, to ensure that when you're talking, they see you and not the other things that might be going on in the environment, right? That's why we have these virtual backgrounds or green screens and other things of that nature, because that way we can set up just about anywhere, and we can actually be seen and not our cat be seen necessarily, or our kids coming in and so forth, which is fine if they do. We actually need to normalize some of these distractions. We need to be human, but there are little things that we can do. So for example, you see all these books that you hear right on my shelf. This is not a virtual thing. It's real. What happened was I started working with my co-author, Karen, and my setup was different than it is right now. I was actually positioned over here, and there's a window over here which you kind of see that natural light coming in, right? Well, I had this great big black, the halo effect, and I had a fish tank in the background, and I had, it was just distracting. And she coached me to say, hey, I see books over there. Are there other books over there? Is there shelves over there? She said, why don't you position it this way? Because you are a professor, so it's kind of professorial to have books in your background. And so she was coaching me in this whole thing. And a lot of those tips are contained in the book, but the real kicker here is just think about your background, think about where you are. And particularly if you're in a meeting where you're presenting or you really need your voice to be heard, make sure that your background isn't distracting for others, right? And so that's something that's kind of unique to the virtual environment that we didn't really have to think about in a face-to-face meeting where we're walking to a conference room and everything looks all the same, right? And then there's also, we mentioned it earlier, the use of collaboration tools, right? So there's ways that you can use different tools to draw attention to things, right? To recognize that, hey, pay attention to this thing, 10%, right? Okay. So there's ways that you can use the tools to draw attention to things. There's ways that you can, of course, I have to erase those annotations now. There we go. I think. Maybe not. Well, anyway, regardless, you got to know how to use the tools, right? And so that's an important thing as well. So maybe I can get it erased. There we go. See, I can be taught. Oh, but that's the thing, is that everyone kind of assumed that, okay, we're just going to go home, we're going to turn on the camera and be good to go. The reality is there's a learning curve. And when you work with people from different places who have different tools, and you got to learn all their different tools, it gets really, really complicated, right? And so my advice to you would be figure out the tools that work for you and invite people into those spaces with you. So that way they can start to learn that and they can understand that, and you can collaboratively make sense of the environment that you're in as you make decisions and work together. So, all right. Now, with that, there are also some additional opportunities you might be interested in being aware of. So first off, I run the Center for Meeting Effectiveness at the University of Utah, and we do all sorts of different services, and we do all sorts of different research, working with people. So if there's an interest there, we're always looking for new partners and new opportunities to collaborate. You can also partner with startup companies. I've actually been invited to on advisory boards for startup companies, and they're often willing to share their resources, share their new software, their new tool, that sort of thing, without any cost to you, because they want to get it out there and want people to start using it. So there's possibilities there as well. And then before I go to the next thing, are there questions at this point that you want to ask about what I've said up to this point? Because I know Kathy asked me to share some bonus content, as it were, about volunteers in meetings, right? Which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to make sure that if you have questions up to this point, I'd like to go ahead and answer those. And I don't see any in the chat necessarily yet. So questions at this point, or should I keep going?
Anybody got anything that you're curious about?
Could you show slide 1 and 2 very fast? Yes, I think I can. Hang on. Slide 1 and 2 meaning recommendations 1 and 2? Or slide 1 and 2, the first and second slide of the deck? Karen, do you?
Recommendations.
Recommendations. I just realized that's what I thought. Okay, here we go. That I can do. Okay, recommendation 1, recognize the need for recovery. Okay, insert some humanity into your meetings. Okay. And then the second one is engage in best practices from 2019. Okay, there's lots of good books. I actually recommend Stephen Rogelberg's Surprising Science of Meetings is a good book on best practices pre-COVID. Okay, so that could be helpful. And then one more in the chat. You're welcome, Karen. All right. So why don't I go ahead and share the bonus content that I know that Kathy was kind of excited about, because this is something that came out really recently, right? Even though it was collected with data in pre-COVID, right? That's often happens, and this is one of the complaints that people have about academics, is that we do research and we collect data, and it's years before that information is out. And so this is data from a couple of years ago. And this is the diagram in the scientific study. You're thinking, okay, I can read the words, but what does all that mean, right? So what this is actually showing are these 3 things, okay? Volunteers in nonprofit organizations need to feel like they're involved, right? They need to be valued. They need to be recognized, okay? And one of the key places that this could happen is in workplace meetings, okay? Meaning meetings between the staff and leadership of the organization and those that volunteer. Okay. And what we found is that when you have those meetings and you actually involve them, you bring them into the decision making and into what's going on, and you do it in an effective and satisfying way, volunteers are more likely to speak up. And here you've got volunteers who are a brain trust, right? They know things, they see things, they have ideas that you wouldn't necessarily think of. That's why you want them. That's why you invite them in, not just because, if you're in a soup kitchen, they can fill, cups of soup, or that they can make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for kids, that are going home after school, but because they have ideas, because they have brains, because they have experience in maybe they volunteer in their free time and they have a full-time job doing XYZ, and that XYZ just happens to be the very thing you need, right? But you don't know it unless you meet with them, unless you talk to them. So if you have effective and satisfying meetings, they're going to speak up. They're going to say, hey, I know a little bit about that. Maybe I could help you with that. Or what do you think about this? They'll proffer their ideas, right? Also, effective and satisfying meetings engage volunteers, not only in saying, hey, what about this? Or hey, what about that? But they're more likely to volunteer again. They're more likely to, we hear about this idea of employee engagement. That's what I mean by engagement here. I mean that they bring their whole self into the environment. Whereas sometimes volunteers come in and they want to just do the task, right? But if you show them that you value them, not only will they do that task, they'll bring their whole self into that environment, meaning their work self, their dad self, their mom self, they'll bring their volunteer self in this other location. They'll bring their expertise, whatever it is, into the environment, and they'll start to look around and see things that maybe they can help with, right? But if your meetings, if you don't do them well, and if you don't do them at all, then you're losing out on an opportunity, right? And furthermore, if they are effective and satisfying, they don't even have to happen that often. That's the neat thing about it, is that we actually found what the diagram said before. Look at this negative relationship between meeting frequency and effectiveness and satisfaction. That means people don't want a lot of meetings. Quite the opposite. Actually, what they want is they want effective and satisfying meetings. They want a chance to share what they want to share. They'll get engaged and then leave them alone and let them do their job, volunteering or otherwise, right? And so the neat thing about it is, if you're going to have a meeting with your volunteers, make sure you do a good job with it, right? And then the frequency will kind of help take care of itself, right? You'll get a feel for what degree you need to meet with them weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever it might be. Initially, it might need to be a little more frequently than before, because you have to get buy-in. They have to realize, oh, there's this change. There's this desire from the leadership to know what I think and feel. And it may take a couple of meetings, a couple of interactions for them to start to feel that. But once you get it going, and you do an effective, satisfying, following best practices from 2019 and 2020, following those best practices we've already talked about, then you won't have to have it very often. But it will really, provide a capacity building input to the organization. So that's your bonus content. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that was useful. So you're probably thinking, therefore what? You need to make sure that your meetings count when you do these volunteer meetings. Make sure that you do them, and that you do them well. Okay. And then you'll get the benefits from it. If you want more, if you're thinking, wow, Joe, this is really cool stuff. I have wonderful insomnia curing research that I can share with you. Tons of that stuff where I've got those diagrams and things in there that if you don't have a background in neuropsychology or in meeting science, it will cure your insomnia. However, Suddenly Virtual is not written like an academic egghead. So it actually is useful for more people, because you don't have to have a PhD to understand it. You don't have to have a PhD to be able to use it. It's really meant for, I wrote it as a, it was somewhat catharsis for me, because I was in the middle of a pandemic and locked in my office. I had to do something, and I really wanted to give back to the community that's been so meaningful to me. And so I wrote this book in hopes that people will get it and make their virtual meetings just a little bit better. Because if their meetings are a little bit better, then maybe it'll come back and pay off for me, and that my meetings that get put on my calendar by other people might be 50 minutes instead of 60 minutes, or 25 minutes instead of 30 minutes, and all those wonderful things. So with that, there's my contact information. I'll even use the annotation again. Hey, there you go. There's my email. You're also welcome to look up the book, buy the book, or just ask questions for me about the book. Happy to do that as well. But thank you so much. Questions at this point. This is kind of, I deliberately went a little short, because I wanted to make sure that I answered your questions, particularly about the bonus content, about volunteers and nonprofit organizations, which is another area of interest and love for me. I've wrote another book previously about this. It was an edited volume. It's more of an egghead book, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to people who aren't curious about the research. But tell me, what questions do you have? Let's see. The chat. In what ways do you partner with people? Yeah, so a variety of ways. There's the Center for Meaning Effectiveness has two major, three really major things that we do. We do research, right? Like some of the things that I shared. So when we partner with people, sometimes it's about doing research with them, saying, hey, let's partner together. We'll give access to your organization and work with your organization on meetings. We'll ask a few questions because we're curious, and that'll help our research. That'll help you because you'll learn some things about meetings. Second way we do it is we provide consulting services, right? So an organization or an individual can hire us to come and be a fly on the wall and do a quick observation. Those are cheap but powerful, because it provides you specific feedback to you on your team and your meetings. Other groups hire us, large organizations hire us to do more hands-on consulting types of activities as well. And then the third thing we do is we do outreach. We do service, sort of like this, right? Where we talk to groups and share some quick insights that can have some meaningful impact if you choose to engage in them. And that's what we do. Jim,
So,
you asked about hybrid meetings. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kathy.
yeah, I was going to say, Jim brought up the same question I had because we're
Yeah.
looking at the possibility that quite a few of our clubs will be hybrid in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, the neat thing about that is evidently my book is doing well enough that my publisher said, "Hey, can you write something called Suddenly Hybrid?" So that'll be coming out in January. We're writing it right now, and so I'll share some insights just because we're collecting data right now. Because when I write a book, because I'm an egghead scientist, I want to know that what I'm saying is true, right? That I've actually shown in the real world that this is actually how it operates. So we're collecting data right now with some organizations that we're kind of making the transition maybe a little sooner than others to try to understand how hybrid is affecting their environment and how to do it right. And there's a couple things that we've learned. One, the switch from face-to-face to virtual was actually an easier switch than from virtual to hybrid. And there's several reasons why, but the main reason is the skill set needed to run an effective face-to-face meeting and a virtual meeting is pretty similar. Not that people were doing it right. In fact, 51% of meetings were rated as poor prior to the pandemic. Okay, so I'm not saying that your meetings were bad. I'm just saying that half of them probably were. Sorry, but the reality is they weren't very good before. So the switch from face-to-face to online wasn't actually really that difficult. There are definitely some things that we needed to do, and we kind of learned over the course of the last 14 months, hopefully, what some of those things. However, from virtual to hybrid is harder because hybrid can be so many different things, right? Face-to-face, everybody's in the room. Virtual, everybody's on camera or on audio, but you're all there, right? Well, with hybrid, what's going to happen is you're going to have 3 people in a room sitting at a table, 1 camera on them. Then you're going to have 5 people over here in this other room sitting around a table with camera on them. Then you're going to have, 3 people that are just they're square on, so you're going to have Hollywood squares, but within those squares, you're going to have subgroups of people, right, that are actually in the same space. And how many of you have had the experience of being in a meeting, maybe it's pre-pandemic, maybe it's recently, where you were in a room with 4 or 5 people, right? And you had someone on the phone or on the video, and you had your meeting, and then you realized about, as you're about to wrap up, that they hadn't said anything, that they weren't involved, that they weren't included, that you didn't bring them into your space, right? That's the issue. The issue is now let's have 5 people here, 3 people there, 4 people in their squares, and let's try and make sure that everybody gets a chance to participate. You actually have to be very strong in your facilitation. You have to engage. There's a skill set. It's a skill set that's not as easily transferable from face-to-face to virtual, or virtual then to hybrid. Okay? And so that's the real trick there, is that there's a whole area of this idea of facilitation that's going to be necessary, because one of the things we found already in the data was that we had a situation where what I just described, the 5 in one room, the 3 in another room, and then the 4 on the screen. We found that participation was equivalent by camera, not by person. So that meant that the room with 5 people should have had 5 times more talk come out of it from the 5 different people in there than the one person, right? But we found that camera had the same amount of talk time as each of the other cameras. So they had equal participation by camera, but not by person. So there, hybrid is going to be a real challenge. Okay. And so what are some good tips to engage people that are cameras are turned off? I'll get to that in just a second, Marcia. But for hybrid meetings, number one recommendation is learn how to facilitate meetings effectively. Get a book, get a training, hire someone, get coached. Maybe Chris, maybe with your coaching practice, there may be some opportunities there. Regardless, you need an upgrade in your skills. Organizations and individuals who upgrade their skills related to facilitation and to meeting functionality are going to be a whole step ahead than those who do not. Okay, so facilitation, recognizing the need for participation, recognizing the importance of having the cameras on, okay? Because when you're in hybrid, the camera being on is even more important than in the virtual, because now you've got a table, you're trying to keep an eye on it, and someone at the far end of the table says something, you got to have those nonverbals to be able to understand whether what they're saying or how they're saying it. They got to see if they're leaning, sarcasm. It's not easy to catch those things without that additional cue. So cameras become that much more important. Room setups become more important. Now you have to position the room differently. It can't just be everybody sitting around a table with a speaker phone in the room. You've got to have a camera. Best hybrid meetings are going to have cameras that allow everyone to be engaged with the people that are in the other locations. So hybrid is going to be a challenge, and there's lots of ideas and lots of thoughts that I could share in relation to that. But those are a couple. So, okay, other questions that came in the chat.
I think you already answered Marsha's question about the camera, right? Being more important. So we were just sharing that we actually have a panel of techie experts that have been teaching how to do hybrid meetings. But
good.
We haven't really focused yet on the facilitation part of it. They've mainly been teaching people how to set them up, but that is a great idea for an upcoming continuing education class.
Yeah, there's a whole host of things, in terms of skills. One is just how do you set them up properly, right? Yeah. What's the best structure? And the scientist in me is launching a study on networks, communication networks in a hybrid meeting. So if you think about how people communicate, you got these 5 people communicating. They have a communication network. Then you have these 3 people. They have a network, and now you have this interconnected network of communication once you're in the hybrid setting. So the egghead in me is already thinking about what is the best hybrid network of communication in a meeting, right? And it's probably not going to be intuitive for as we might hope it to be. So yeah, I think that would be a great idea. A continuing education related facilitation would be smart and would really upgrade skills in a very needed time. I will add one more thing about Marcia in terms of the camera. That's been a general recommendation that you've heard a lot, is keep your cameras on. There's some Stanford studies that actually showed that if you see yourself, it's kind of, it can be off-putting and create a greater stress for you and greater drain. And so the key here is to know when you need the camera and when you don't. When you're meeting with someone new or with a new group, you absolutely need the camera. When you're meeting with someone who you've known for a while, that you've communicated, you know what they sound like when they smile, you know what they sound like when they frown, you know what their sarcasm is like, you know these nonverbals that they engage in. You can do a phone call, right? You can do an audio meeting. You don't need to do a virtual meeting. So
actually, Tina LeBlanc asked the question. That's your partner in crime here, because she knows your language, but she asked the question that you actually cover in your book. I've heard that one reason that virtual meetings are more exhausting is that we can't read people's nonverbal clues. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah. It is harder to read nonverbal cues in a virtual meeting, particularly when the camera's off. So one of the biggest things we say is you gotta turn the camera on. You got to be willing to put yourself out there, which is why your production value matters, why the background and things, whether it's virtual, virtual background or otherwise, that's why those matter, right? But you got to turn the camera on there, because otherwise there are no nonverbals, right? And so it's a choice between nonverbals or non-nonverbals. But it's a choice between having that part of your communication repertoire or not, right? Now the data, which is actually covered in the book, showed that face-to-face meetings are rated the best. Okay, virtual meetings are virtually tied with face-to-face in terms of effectiveness when the camera is on. And then your audio meetings have a full standard deviation drop, so like a 30% drop in effectiveness when all the cameras are off. Okay, and that really goes back to nonverbals. right? And if you know the person, and can you tell when they're upset or when they're happy or when they're sarcastic or when, can you read the emotions without seeing them? And sometimes some people can. And that goes back to this whole idea of emotional intelligence, right? Some people are more apt at seeing and understanding and empathizing and feeling what others are feeling, and some people are less so. And so if you know who you are, then you probably know that you might need a little more cues than the audio can give you. So looks like we got a hand up from Chris.
Yeah, Tina inspired me with her question. I've heard too that with the hands above the screen, it's like you can see someone's hand and you relax more. But when your hands are below the screen, you don't know what they're doing, and it triggers that older mechanism. And
they're typing.
What are they doing? Are they getting a weapon? The old part of our brains. Is there any studies around that?
Yeah, not yet in terms of meetings, right? And so there's the interesting thing about meetings, and Kathy was kind enough to share my claim to fame, my 25% of all meetings research I've written. That sounds like I'm like sitting here writing all the time, which my wife would think that's actually the case, but it's not actually true. The reality is there's actually not that much research on it. There's as of 2020, there were 214 articles on the topic published, and I've published a quarter of those, right? Which is still, I think, pretty good. But regardless, that's not very much. Think about leadership. Leadership, just Google search leadership and Google Scholar or whatnot. Over 1,000 articles just last year were published on the topic of leadership. So what you bring up, Chris, there just hasn't been a study on that. Okay. However, what I will say is there's been groups and teams research looking at nonverbal behavior, looking at availability of hands and so forth. And there's been some research in meetings research on multitasking. And if you can see their hands, if they use hand gestures and that sort of thing, not that you should have to, but if you do that from time to time, then it's less likely that you're typing on your keyboard, or you're playing with your mouse, or you're whatever, right? And I have a 3-screen setup, and I can easily be doing something over here or over here, turn my camera off, do whatever I want, right? And so what they found is that this was actually out on Wired.com. It was a study. Was it out of Stanford? I forget what university it was out of, but they did a study on multitasking, and they basically confirmed what I published about 10 years ago, which is fine. Just repeat it. It's okay. As long as people hear it, it doesn't matter. But the point is, they found that as meetings get longer and get larger, more multitasking occurs, right? Which means your hands aren't seen because you're busy typing. So, yeah. Great question, Chris.
Thank you.
We are actually out of time, but I invited people that wanted to ask more questions to stay if you're willing to stay, but I do want them to take your advice and get a break, even though this was a fantastic meeting. If you guys want to unmute yourself and give Joseph some Toastmasters love, that would be awesome.
Yay!
Thanks all. It was a pleasure being here. I'm happy to stick around for a little bit. I do recognize, if you have something right after this, do take that moment to have a bit of humanity, find the restroom, refresh your beverage, cognitively switch to the next thing you're going to. That's totally fine. I try to practice what I preach. I'm not going to the next session. I apologize. I have kid duty. So, but I can linger for a little bit and answer questions if folks would like to stick around. So.
Okay. Yeah, we have a break until 1:00 when they can attend that next session, they can attend any or all of the sessions, but there is a lunch break scheduled.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions for Joseph while he's still here?
I don't have a question for Joseph, but I do have one for you, Kathy, after this is over.
Okay.
One of the things I would say is thank you for the presentation. And I was motivated by myself, my own training in the beginning of this pandemic. How do I create more interaction online? So I strove to do that in what I do. Now, I think I'm pretty good at it. I've had someone the other day said, wow, you had me for 90 minutes on Zoom and present the whole time. So I've worked on my facilitation skills to do that.
Yeah.
and I see a lot of people that don't do that. And I do see also the challenge. I've had a few hybrid meetings around the world, and they are going to be more challenging. And I've had to work. It feels like I have to work more, pulling energy from different places on that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I hear from people when they talk about the differences between a virtual or a face-to-face or a hybrid meeting, is that, with a virtual meeting, you have to put in a little more effort to facilitate it. You have to ask people for their participation. It's like leveling up is what hybrid is like. That you have to do that much work, that much harder. Well, the problem though is if we now go to hybrid meetings and we have the same number of meetings as we have now, right? And now we're expected if you're a meeting leader and you have to be that much more on in order to get the interaction and so forth, you think Zoom fatigue and so forth were bad before. We're going to have hybrid fatigue, right? It's just going to be very fatiguing for those who are facilitating the meetings. And so that goes back to the initial issue of we've got to make sure our meetings right from the beginning are actually good, that we have to do some of the best practices, because we know the science has told us that one bad meeting causes at minimum 4 more meetings. Right?
Is that really true?
That is really true. I have data that we've published that one bad meeting causes at least 4 more meetings. And the reason that is because, the average meeting size is between 5 and 7 people, which means now if you have a bad meeting, that means maybe one person in the room actually understood it. And now you have to go and have one-on-ones or pop into people's offices. You have to bump into Bob, as it were, and get clarification on the thing that you were trying to communicate or that was trying to happen in that meeting. So yeah, one bad meeting, 4 more meetings.
I love that stat. I mean, that'll help with my facilitation and working with the leaders I work with. One bad meeting, 4 meetings created from that one bad meeting.
Yeah,
that's good.
That is what the science tells us. And that's why I say, hey, if you want to have fewer meetings, make sure your meetings are good. The other thing I'll mention is that there's this issue of meeting leader blind spot. And this is something I found in data in a few different ways. I haven't published this yet. So this is data that still needs to be written up. But I've talked about it in a couple of different places, but I haven't published the data. The key here is that, and this is one of the reasons why I struggle to get organizations on board to making their meetings a bit more effective, because when you say, hey, meetings need to be better, than the person thinks, oh, my meetings are fine. My meetings are great. Everybody tells me how wonderful my meetings are. Well, the problem is they're the boss and they're the employees, right?
Yeah.
So is it your meeting and that you pay them to work for you? Well, of course it was a good meeting. They're not going to tell you it was lousy. They want to make sure that you keep paying their check, right? And their bills and everything, right? So there's this issue of meeting leader blind spot, that meeting leaders think that their meetings are good, but people actually rate their meetings about 20 to 30% lower than the ratings of the leader. Right?
Thank you for sharing that as well. I'll share you one insight into that. I work with CEOs all the time, and one of the CEOs said, I don't even know if I'm funny. And his point was people had to laugh at his jokes.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly right. And that's why it's really hard to know whether a leader in an organization, a CEO or a director or whatnot, whether they actually have good or bad meetings, because you can't get honest feedback from the people that are in the meetings. And so the only way to really know is to be a fly on the wall and to provide them the actual feedback directly, right? Unless they've built a trusting and psychologically safe environment, which unfortunately, even when you do that, you're still going to have a tough time getting people to tell you how bad your meetings probably are. So,
no, that's really good. That helps me a lot. And what I know I need to do to up my hybrid meetings is get a bigger screen, because then so I can see into that meeting. Like the other day, there was 7 people in a room. I could barely see, I couldn't see facial expressions now, especially the people in the back room. So I was missing that. And for me, I present in gallery view so I can see everyone's face. And in hybrid, I cannot see that.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to that's why hybrid's such a challenge, because you're going to have such a, just like when we first went to suddenly virtual, right? Where people thought that their webcam on their laptop was going to be sufficient. The reality is they're low quality, right? And so that's why in April and May, if you tried to find a webcam on Amazon or anywhere else, you weren't going to find them. they were all sold out because people were all upgrading because they realized their little dot on their laptop, or if they didn't even have a dot on their laptop, they had to have something, right? But now we're able to upgrade, right? That's why we have high definition, which means you might want to put on some makeup, or or wash your face before you, or make sure you didn't make a mess of yourself at lunch or whatever. You got to be a little more mindful because now they can see you. However, with hybrid, you bring up another challenge. That little webcam you got sitting on the top of your computer, is that going to work for a room? Probably not, right? And in the room cameras, are the room cameras set up so that way when someone talks, does it zoom in on them? Does it zoom in both auditorially and physically? Do you see them and hear them? And the reality is they're starting to have that technology, but it's still being developed, right? It's starting to be available, but it's not fully available, and it's going to cost a bunch to be, for a while. So organizations are trying to upgrade their room spaces, and if you're trying to find a room camera right now, it's going to start getting more difficult. And then of course we have the chip shortage and so forth. So we're going to have, if we don't prepare now, this transition is going to be that much harder come later this year and into next year.
I wanted to take a minute to share a story for the benefit mainly of the Toastmasters, Joseph, but you may find it interesting too. I think we are the responsible people if we are members of a corporation, because as Toastmasters, we're the meeting experts in our organizations. We can't take Joseph with us everywhere we go. We don't have that many bad meetings at Medtronic. My boss's boss's boss, who will be here at our conference today, is actually a fantastic meeting facilitator. However, I was in a meeting with an IT manager who let someone completely dominate a meeting that was supposed to be like a brainstorming. And I took it upon myself to email her and let her know what the problem was with that meeting and how to fix it. And if you guys are in meetings in your organizations, I highly recommend. And I'm not the most tactful person, but I really tried hard that day when I emailed her, and she told me she appreciated it. Whether or not she did, I'm not sure. But please let your organizations know, if you've got people that don't know how to run a meeting, invite them to a Toastmasters meeting. We know how to do it. But I want to take a minute and please just give him another round of applause. This was a fantastic meeting. It was recorded. So if you know people that need to see it, you can let them know. The link will be available. And Joseph, thank you so much. And we definitely will be inviting you back, both of you guys, in the future. And I hope you can come and visit with us again.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. This was a pleasure. And yeah, keep me in mind for the future. It'd be great to interact with you all again. So.
Thanks, everybody.